Hello, Dr. Mashburn here, and so today we're going to talk about the blood. So I'm going to introduce to you the topic of blood, go over some basics about the blood, and then the future videos will be more specifically about red blood cells, white blood cells, and things of that nature. Alright, so let me get my pen. Sorry about that. Okay, so what is blood? So thinking back to what you've learned in previous A&P courses, we learned about different types of tissue, and blood is a connective tissue. So remember the connective tissues like bone and fat, dense irregular, that coming back, parts of the skin. So blood is the fluid connective tissue, whereas bone would be the solid connective tissue. And so when you look at blood, it has plasma, which is non-living, it's the fluid, the matrix, has formed elements, which are the cells, and these are the living portions of the blood. And these include the erythrocytes, or red blood cells, and the leukocytes, which are the white blood cells, and then platelets, which are called thrombocytes. So erythrocytes, leukocytes, and thrombocytes are the three types of cells, or parts of cells. I'll talk about platelets a little bit later, that are inside your blood. Now the blood does various different things. It's multifunctional, and one of the jobs it has is to distribute stuff, or substances. So maybe oxygen, carbon dioxide, sugar, hormones, anything that needs to move throughout the body is going to be carried or can be carried through the blood. We have things that regulate blood levels, and so you're regulating blood levels of things like sugar, glucose, hormones, things like that. So blood has kind of has a regulatory function, and then also protection. And so you're probably wondering, well, how does blood protect us? Well, our immune cells, our white blood cells, are part of our blood, so that's part of our immune system. So it helps us confer immunity and protect us against bacteria, viruses, and things like that. So you'll do a blood lab, and so when you're looking at blood, I'm just going to kind of quickly show you what to expect when we talk about the lab portion of the blood. But what you see if you do a blood smear are lots of little pink discs, and these are the erythrocytes. And a lot of times they have kind of a clear center because erythrocytes are kind of like almost like an inner tube. So they're thick on the outside and kind of thin in the middle. It's solid, it's not a hole there, but it's kind of thin in the middle. It's called a biconcave disc. And so you'll see lots and lots of pink discs. Those are your red blood cells. And then the large cells that have a darkly stained nucleus, these are the white blood cells. And there's more than one type of blood cell. We're going to learn about 5 different types of blood cells: neutrophils, lymphocytes, basophils, eosinophils, and monocytes. We're going to learn about those different white blood cells and what they do. So all of these, this one, this one, this one, and that one, are all examples of your white blood cells. And then what looks like trash, these are the platelets. So these are thrombocytes that are broken up and made these little platelets, and they're for blood clotting. So the erythrocytes, that's what carries oxygen and CO2. Okay, your white blood cells, your neutrophils, lymphocytes, monocytes, those are white blood cells that you use for immunity, and your platelets are for blood clotting. So you may have had blood drawn before and you wonder, what are they doing when they draw your blood? What are they looking at? So you take the blood, put it in a tube, and many times they will centrifuge it. And when they centrifuge it, spin it really, really fast, it causes the heavy stuff to sink to the bottom and then the lighter stuff to stay on top. And so when you do that, you'll see that there's going to be a predictable arrangement of what's found when you centrifuge it out. And at the bottom, you're going to have the erythrocytes, the red blood cells. And they're heavy because you have the hemoglobin, and the hemoglobin has iron in it, so it does kind of make it heavy, so it kind of sinks to the bottom. Then you have what's called the buffy coat, a very thin white layer, which is where the leukocytes and platelets are. Not very much, about 1% of the total volume. And the rest of it is the plasma, or the liquid portion. It's not very dense, so therefore it stays on top. Okay, so the bottom part where you have your buffy coat and erythrocytes are your formed elements, and then everything above that is your plasma. And one of the measurements that you can get from doing that is your hematocrit, which is the percent of blood volume that is RBCs, or red blood cells. And that's important if you're trying to figure out maybe oxygen carrying capacity if someone's anemic. You can also look at their hemoglobin levels, and so we'll talk about that a little bit later. Hemoglobin levels, but you can also just do a hematocrit. And in males, about 47% of your blood should be red blood cells. That should be your hematocrit. In females, 42 is a normal hematocrit, or percentage of red blood cells of the total blood. So what is blood? What is it like? What does it look like? What does it feel like? It's a sticky, kind of opaque fluid that has a metallic taste. So if you've ever cut yourself and sucked your finger, it's kind of metallic. Well, it's salty as well, and so the metal comes from the iron that's in your blood. The color is going to be some version of red, either a scarlet red if it's high in oxygen levels, so arterial blood, or a dark red, kind of venous blood when it's low in oxygen. Has a set characteristic pH. The pH of blood should be between 7.35 and 7.45, and it shouldn't vary too much outside of that. If the pH is higher or lower than 7.35, 7.45, you've got something called alkalosis or acidosis, and we'll talk more about that later on in the semester. It's about 8% of your body weight, and the average amount of blood that you have in males, 5 to 6 liters, and in females, 4 to 5 liters of blood. So what's in the blood plasma? Well, mostly water. So 90% of your blood plasma is simply water, but it does have over 100 dissolved solutes. So these are things, substances that are dissolved in the water in the plasma of the blood. For example, nutrients like sugar, glucose, gases, hormones, waste products, proteins, your electrolytes like sodium and calcium are dissolved in the blood plasma. And there are also large plasma proteins. Okay, so these large plasma proteins, we're going to talk about the osmotic pressure of blood, and so they help us exert an osmotic pressure, which I'll tell you about a little bit later. But these plasma proteins, they stay in the blood. So a lot of these things, these nutrients, gases, hormones, waste proteins, and organic ions, a lot of these things can move back and forth between the blood and the body. So like, for example, oxygen can leave the blood, go off to your body cells. Carbon dioxide, which is a byproduct of cellular respiration, can leave the cells and go into the blood. But the proteins, they stay in the blood. Okay, these large plasma proteins stay in the blood. And most of them are made by the liver. And some examples of some of these large plasma proteins are albumin, globulins, and fibrinogen. And this one has a large effect on osmotic pressure, which I'll talk to you a little bit later on. And fibrinogen has something to do with blood clotting. Okay, so we're going to get to all of these later. I just want to kind of give you an idea, general idea of what they do now. So the albumin, that is 60% of your plasma proteins, and it has 3 functions. It is a substance carrier, it's a blood buffer, and it's the major contributor to plasma osmotic pressure. So things can be carried on like a taxi, so it can carry things throughout the blood. When I say it's a blood buffer, this has to do with pH. It allows you, kind of helps to buffer the pH and keep your pH normal. And then it has, and we'll talk more in detail later, and then has plays a major role in plasma osmotic pressure. So if you think back to hopefully 201, your earlier A&Ps, maybe you had a cell and you talked about how you maybe have a lot of sodium on the outside and maybe a little bit of sodium on the inside. And so if sodium would go down its concentration gradient, it would go this way, and that would, as the sodium levels increased in this side of the cell, then eventually the sodium outside and sodium inside would become equal if the membrane was completely permeable. But remember, our cells are selectively permeable. And so they're selectively permeable to a lot of things, including these ions and also water. So what was the one thing that you remember from 201, from your first A&P? Water and sodium, what's the relationship there? Water follows sodium. Okay, so water follows sodium. And so because albumin doesn't leave the plasma, as solutes are moving in and out, you want something to stay in the blood vessel that will help hold the water in the blood vessel. So if you had a lot of sodium, outside the blood vessel, just for example, all your water would leave, right? But you don't really want all your water to leave your blood vessels, because you need the volume in your blood vessels to help you maintain your blood pressure. So in the blood, this is kind of a simplistic view, but in the blood, this albumin that stays inside the vessels, it kind of acts like sodium, a little more powerful than sodium. It kind of holds that water and pulls that water back in. So it creates, it allows for water, which osmosis, remember water doesn't diffuse, it osmosis, it allows for that water to remain in the blood vessel and therefore keep your blood volume up, and then keep your blood pressure up. And we'll come back to this as we move through blood vessels and blood pressure, and then how the kidney works. So again, albumin plays a major role in plasma osmotic pressure, and so we'll do a little bit more about that as we move forward. The formed elements, these are the cells. So you have white blood cells, red blood cells, and platelets. Your white blood cells are your only complete cells. They have a nucleus, they have all your organelles, and they're alive, and they can live for a long, long time. They have all that they need to maintain and stay alive. Whereas red blood cells have no organelles. So when a red blood cell is formed in the bone marrow, as it matures, and then it's sent out into the system to do its job and carry oxygen and carbon dioxide and things like that. Before it becomes mature, it kind of spits out all of its stuff, including the nucleus and all the other organelles. And that's so that you can increase the amount of carrying capacity. So basically you empty it out of all the organelles and create more space to carry more oxygen and carbon dioxide. So it's very efficient. That's all it does. It's just a carrying bag for oxygen and carbon dioxide. Platelets, the thrombocytes, as they leave the bone marrow and enter into the blood, they break apart, and so you have these little small parts. So platelets are just parts of cells, and they're the cell fragments that we use to clot our blood. Most of our formed elements don't live very long in our bloodstream. We recycle our red blood cells about every 100 days. White blood cells may live a couple of weeks, but some live a long, long time, and we'll talk a little bit when we get to immunity, especially about how long a cell can last in your body. But most of your blood cells don't divide. So once they leave the bone marrow, they don't divide again. Okay, so again, they're short-lived cells, but some live a little longer than others, and we'll talk more about that later on. So the distribution functions of blood, mainly of oxygen and carbon dioxide, and then also CO2 and hormones. That's the major things that it's transporting. So it's taking oxygen and sugars like glucose to the proteins, fats, whatever it's carrying to the body cells, including electrolytes. So this is going to be carried from the heart through the arteries. So you may not remember this from 201, but remember you have a heart, and you have vessels that come to the heart and vessels that go away from the heart. So the arteries are going away, and the veins, I almost wrote that backwards. The veins are coming into the heart, and the arteries are going away from the heart. So this is, say, my heart would be right here. So blood from the heart through the arteries, delivering stuff to the body cells. At the capillary, where the arteries and veins kind of join together, this is where the exchange takes place. This is where things can go from the blood to the body, from the body back to the blood. So you would take nutrients and gases to the cells, and then you would take metabolic wastes like from the lungs and kidneys out, and so that you can eliminate it. I'm sorry, you would transport your metabolic waste to the lungs and kidneys so that they can be eliminated. Sometimes I get talking faster than my brain can keep up. And then also transporting hormones. And if you think back to earlier anatomy, you have two control systems in your body, the nervous system and the endocrine system. The endocrine system makes hormones, which are chemicals that go through your blood and cause cells to react in some way. Like, for example, growth hormone would cause your bones and muscles to grow. Estrogen, testosterone, plays a role in reproductive health. And we'll talk more about hormones later. So those are the main functions, the main distribution functions. Has some regulation functions, and one of those functions is body temperature. It can maintain your body temperature by absorbing and distributing heat. So if you think back again to earlier anatomy, your body's mostly water, and so water releases and absorbs heat slowly. So because your blood's mostly water, that allows us to maintain our temperature relatively constant. But if we get really, really hot, we can shunt blood to the surface, to the skin where you flush, and that allows you to dissipate more heat. If you're cold, you can shunt that blood toward the core and retain that heat. So we use our blood to help us distribute and absorb and distribute heat. We use our blood to maintain our pH. So we have to have a normal pH in our bodies. All of our chemical reactions need a very specific pH in order to occur. And so the blood helps us do that. And one of the things the blood does is it has a buffer in it called a bicarbonate, alkaline reserve bicarbonate ion, which is kind of like a Tums or baking soda, basically, is in your blood to help neutralize acids and keep your blood pH normal. We'll again talk about more later. And then also, you have to have enough fluid inside your vessels, your blood vessels, your arteries and veins and heart and that whole system to maintain blood pressure. And so blood is the volume part, and so the more volume you have, the higher your pressure. And so you want to regulate that pressure. You don't want too much, you don't want too little. So you want to keep that blood volume just right to keep your blood pressure regulated. I like to think about taking a garden hose, and if you filled it up with water and then you squeezed it and caused the diameter to get smaller, it would increase the pressure. So one of the things we do is or you could just turn the volume of the water up and down. So if you had an empty hose, you turn the water way up, you'd have a lot of water squirting out the end. If you turned it way down, the water would trickle out at a lower pressure. So blood helps us maintain that volume, which helps us maintain our blood pressure. It gives us protective functions. One thing, you don't want to lose a lot of blood, so the blood has its own clotting factors. So if you do cut yourself, everything that you need in order for blood to clot and not bleed out is found in the blood, and we'll talk about those processes. And also it plays a really large role in fighting infection through the immune system. So your blood has antibodies, okay, which are those globulins we talked about a little while ago. I mentioned some of the proteins that are in your body. So antibodies are kind of floating around in your blood looking for things they can grab onto, and those will allow your white cells to recognize that and destroy them. Complement proteins also play a role in immunity, and then white blood cells. So this will make more sense when we talk about immunity, but that's what's going on in immunity. A lot of that's occurring in the blood. Again, more detail later. This is just kind of introduction. When we say talk about blood formation, the term we use is hematopoiesis. So poetic is poiesis is to make or to begin, and hemato would be blood. And so blood cells are made in the bone marrow, and specifically the red bone marrow. You may remember that in an adult skeleton you have both red and yellow marrow. The yellow's more fatty for energy storage. And so your bone marrow has these reticular web-like connective tissues and blood sinuses, which is where the blood cells are made. And so when you think about an adult, you're going to find this in your axial skeleton, your girdles, and the proximal epiphysis of the humerus and the femur. So you have a lot of bone marrow as in children and going through adolescence, a lot of red marrow. But as you get to be adult, most of that red marrow becomes fatty marrow, yellow marrow, and you just have a couple of places left in your body where you still make red blood cells and white blood cells. You still have red bone marrow, just not as much because you're replacing and maintaining, but you're not having to make a whole lot for growth. Okay. So hematopoiesis, you have to have a stem cell, a precursor or a kind of progenitor, a beginning cell. And so that's called the hematopoietic stem cell or hemocytoblast. If you remember, blast are those young immature cells. Hemo means blood, cyte means cell, so hemocytoblast is a young blood cell. And these cells give rise to all of your formed elements, okay? And so you have this one cell, and it can become anything, okay? It can become a white blood cell, become a red blood cell, become whatever. But in the presence of certain hormones and growth factors, it will then be pushed toward a certain line. Okay, so maybe you need more red blood cells, and we're going to talk about this later, but something called erythropoietin is now introduced into your system, and that causes you to make more red blood cells. Erythropoietin is a hormone that pushes these stem cells toward the red blood cell line. Once a cell has committed, it's started down that path, it won't change. It will continue down that path. So your new blood cells are going to then enter those blood sinusoids and then out into the vessels and out into your actual blood circulation. So this is in your book, and you can look at this picture. I know it's kind of small to see on the screen, but this is called your called pluripotent stem cell. It's that hemocytoblast. And so again, depending on what you need, here are your final products at this end. Okay, this is what's you can see. That's what's actually going out in, well, here you go, out into the blood, your final product. So depending on what you need, certain factors and hormones will act on that and then cause these cells to then divide and go down that particular path. So they can either go down what's called the lymphoid path or the myeloid path. Okay, so if it goes down the lymphoid path, again, depending on what's going on, which hormones and what's involved, it will then either become a B cell or a T cell. Okay, and we're going to talk about what these do, but they are types of lymphocytes that your body uses as part of the immune system. So these will progress as they become B cells and plasma cells, and the T cells will become T cells. All right, and they're going to go to part of your thymus and part of your lymphoid areas of your body. The myeloid stem cells, they're more diverse, and so they can either become myeloblasts, which are going to take you to become neutrophils and basophils and eosinophils. They may be monoblasts, which will become monocytes. They may be pronormoblasts, which takes you down the red blood cell path line, or a megakaryocyte, which becomes the thrombocytes and then later the platelets. We're not in medical lab technology, and you guys aren't going to have to do a whole lot of identification of these immature cells. What I really want you to know is that you have a stem cell. I want you to know the two major lines, okay, that it can either become a myeloid stem cell or a lymphoid stem cell. And I want you to know which one are the adult cells, if they come from the myeloid line or if they come from the lymphoid line. So if I said, okay, a B cell, you would need to know that that was a lymphoid cell. If I said it was a basophil or an eosinophil, you would know that came from the myeloid line. Okay. When we talk about red blood cells, we'll go into a little more detail about the red blood cells, but I'll save that for another lecture. All right, so that's all I've got today. The next thing we'll do is talk more in detail about the erythrocytes, and I will see you then. Thank you.